The wind sliced across the ridge like a cold, unrelenting whip, rattling the bare branches of the sparse pines that clung stubbornly to the rocky soil. Dust swirled in lazy eddies along the dirt road that led to a cluster of small houses perched on the edge of Mill Creek, a town that had seen better days and still wore its grit like armor. In the late afternoon sun, the houses looked tired, their paint flaking and sagging under the weight of years, each one telling its own story of perseverance, neglect, or quiet resignation. In the middle of this landscape, at the end of a short lane that sloped down toward the creek, there was a house unlike the others. Its walls, made of rough-cut wood, had been patched and repaired more times than anyone could remember. The siding bore the scars of decades: splintered boards, faded paint, and nails stubbornly holding things together against gravity and time. Most neighbors walked past with a subtle shake of the head, muttering half-hearted warnings to their children not to wander too close to Old Man Harris's place. Harris, for his part, didn't care much what they thought. He was 72, lean and wiry, with hands that looked like carved driftwood, calloused from years of hammering, sawing, and lifting. His hair, once black, was now white as snow, though stubborn streaks of dark still ran along the temples. He had the eyes of someone who had spent more time watching the world than speaking to it, the kind of eyes that measured everything, weight, distance, intention, before allowing himself to react. But lately, Harris had been restless. The winters were getting harsher, or maybe he just noticed it more. Last year, a week-long snowstorm had buried the little house under a blanket of white, and though the fire in the old cast-iron stove roared, the cold seeped into the corners, pooling along the floorboards and settling into his bones. He'd shivered through the nights, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind gnawing at the wood, whispering to him that it was time to try something different. So he had decided to build a stone shell over his house. The neighbors had laughed when they saw the first few rough piles of rock at the base of the walls, their voices carrying across the lane. "You lost your mind, Harris," called out Jenkins, a man in his 50s with a belly that strained against his flannel shirt. "You planning to turn that shack into a castle for mice?" "You'll freeze before you even finish it," Mrs. Caldwell chimed in, clutching the hem of her apron as if to shield herself from the absurdity. "Stone walls, over wood, that's just dumb." Harris didn't reply. He only wiped the sweat from his brow and placed the next stone carefully, testing its balance before letting it settle. Each rock had its own personality, weight, shape, texture, and he treated them like old friends, coaxing them into place instead of forcing them. It was slow, painstaking work, and the laughter of the neighbors echoed around him, a constant reminder that the world rarely understood what it couldn't see immediately. The first week he hauled rocks from the creek bed below, damp with snowmelt and slick underfoot. He tied a rope around his shoulders, grunting with effort as he tugged the heavier boulders up the slope. His legs ached, his hands bled, and the cold nipped at his ears, but there was a rhythm to it, a kind of meditative pace that allowed him to forget everything else: the gossip, the judgment, the small-town doubts that clung to him like cobwebs. Evenings were the hardest. As the sun sank behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the yard, Harris would sit by his stove, hands stretched toward the fire, and think about what he was building. Not just the stones or the walls, but the idea of warmth that could last. 2 days, that was the goal. If he could build something that held heat for 2 days, he could weather the worst of winter without surrendering to it. And if he could do that, perhaps he could prove, though not to anyone in particular, that ingenuity and patience still mattered, even in a world that seemed to value speed over thought. Neighbors continued to gossip. One afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell leaned over her fence, peering at Harris with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "You sure that's safe, Harold?" she asked. "Looks like it could collapse at any minute." "It's not collapsing," Harris said without looking up. His voice was calm, but the edge in it suggested he'd been asked that same question 100 times and was tiring of repeating the answer. "It'll stand just fine if you know what you're doing." "Well, I hope so. Don't want you flattened under a pile of rocks." He offered her a faint smile, more polite than friendly, and returned to his work. Inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction. There was a rhythm to stacking stone, a logic to its imperfections, and every irregularity he corrected strengthened the whole. It wasn't just construction, it was survival, artistry, and stubborn pride all rolled into one. By the second week, the stone shell was taking shape. The neighbors' mockery had shifted to whispers of skepticism and awe. The walls weren't perfect. Jagged stones jutted out unpredictably, giving the structure an uneven, almost organic appearance. Yet it had a strange beauty. In the late afternoon sun, shadows danced across the surfaces, and the house seemed less like a hovel and more like a sculpture forged from the earth itself. Harris worked tirelessly, his movements precise, almost ceremonial. Each stone placed was a calculation, the weight, the balance, the way it would radiate heat once the fire burned inside. He had experimented before, testing small piles of stones over sections of the floor, seeing how long they retained warmth, and adjusting his method with each attempt. The neighbors didn't see this. They only saw a stubborn old man and a growing mound of rocks. Late one evening, after the last rays of sunlight had fled and the sky had turned the deep blue of early night, Harris lit the stove for the first full test. He filled it with dry wood, careful to layer it in the way he'd learned over decades, and watched as the flames licked the edges of the iron. Smoke curled upward, mingling with the crisp night air, and for a moment the world felt suspended. He stayed awake, checking the temperature in different corners, marveling at the subtle differences the stone shell made. It was warmer than he'd expected, the heat creeping slowly from the stove, settling into the walls, and holding longer than any night he had endured before. By midnight, the warmth had become almost tangible, a soft, steady presence that seemed to hug him from all sides. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the remaining wooden houses in the lane, but Harris felt a calm defiance. He could hear the distant chuckles of neighbors still awake, but now there was a thread of uncertainty in their laughter, a hint that perhaps he wasn't entirely mad. As the first hints of dawn broke across the ridge, spilling pink and gold across the landscape, Harris stepped outside. The air was sharp and snow glistened along the fence posts, but he felt a deep, quiet warmth inside him. The stones had held. The fire had burned, the heat had stayed, and for the first time in years, he had confidence that his home could withstand the merciless winter. He looked at the neighbors' houses, the crooked fences, the faded shutters, and felt a strange mix of triumph and isolation. They would see eventually. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day they would understand. And until then, he had his stones, his stove, and the knowledge that perseverance and ingenuity had turned laughter into something far more potent: survival. Harris smiled faintly, brushing the snow from his coat. The road ahead was long, and the shell was far from finished, but tonight he had proof. Proof that the world could mock him, doubt him, and even try to stop him, but nothing could take away the warmth he had fought to create. Winter had settled into Mill Creek like a stubborn guest, and the mornings arrived with a bite that made the eyes water and the skin ache. Frost glazed the branches, turning the world into a brittle, shimmering sculpture, and the creek itself groaned under the thin layer of ice that had begun to form. Harris moved through this frozen landscape with the ease of someone who had lived a lifetime outdoors. Every step on the snow-crusted path was deliberate, every breath visible, curling like smoke in the frigid air. The stone shell had grown taller now, covering more of the wooden walls, and the neighbors' laughter had evolved into murmurs of incredulity. Some drove past slowly in their trucks, craning necks to get a better look. Others stopped by the fence, leaning in silently, watching Harris work as if he were performing some strange, private ritual. "You're really gonna finish that thing, huh?" called out Jenkins one morning, stepping out of his pickup with a thermos of coffee in hand. His voice carried both curiosity and lingering skepticism. "I am," Harris replied, wiping sweat from his forehead even though the temperature hovered below freezing. "It's not done yet, but it will be." Jenkins snorted. "You ever think about just, I dunno, hiring someone, make it easier?" Harris shook his head. "Easier doesn't last, that's the problem with easy." He picked up a flat, heavy slab of stone and tested its weight in his hands, turning it over, feeling the texture. "If I do it myself, it's done right, and it lasts. That's what matters." Jenkins raised his eyebrows but said nothing more. He took a sip from his thermos, then muttered, "Well, good luck, old man." He drove off slowly, the truck stirring the powdery snow into small clouds behind him. Harris returned to his work, methodically placing stone after stone. Each one was a challenge, not just in weight, but in the way it fit eye. NTO, the larger pattern. He had learned to read the stones, noticing subtle imperfections, the way one might sense the rhythm of a friend's heartbeat. Some had to be wedged just so, others needed to be chiseled slightly to fit snugly. He worked patiently, methodically, letting no frustration bleed into his movements. But the real test had yet to come. The storm that the weather reports had predicted for the past week finally arrived. A wild, relentless assault of wind, snow, and sleet that battered Mill Creek without mercy. By late afternoon, the snow was already waist-deep in places, and the wind shrieked like a banshee along the ridge. Harris stood at the edge of his half-finished stone shell, staring at the sky, feeling the sharp sting of snowflakes on his face. He pulled his coat tighter and muttered to himself, a quiet vow that he wouldn't retreat. The fire inside his house had been lit hours ago, and he could only hope that the heat would hold. Inside, the stove roared, and the warmth began to seep into the stone walls. Harris monitored it carefully, placing his hands against the cold exterior every so often to see how far the heat had penetrated. Slowly, gradually, the temperature inside stabilized. The stones absorbed the heat, trapping it and radiating it back into the room in waves. Harris smiled faintly, his breath forming little clouds in the warm air. He had done the calculations, yes, but seeing it succeed under real conditions, that was another level entirely. By evening, the storm was at its peak. The wind rattled the trees and shrieked around the corners of the house, but inside, Harris felt a calm he hadn't known in years. The stove had burned for hours, and the heat, stubborn and consistent, filled the space. He moved from one corner to another, checking every nook, making sure the warmth was evenly distributed. It was a quiet triumph, almost sacred in its simplicity. Outside, a few neighbors had ventured out to check on the damage the storm was causing elsewhere, and they couldn't help but glance at Harris's house. From a distance, it looked impervious, a strange, stoic fortress amidst the swirling snow. Some of the onlookers, despite themselves, felt a pang of respect, or at least reluctant acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, Harris knew something they didn't. Hours passed. The storm raged. Harris sat near the stove, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, watching the flames dance. He thought of past winters, the nights when he shivered under blankets, the mornings when frostbite threatened to claim fingers and toes despite every precaution. And he realized something profound. This was different. He had built not just a shelter, but a system. A living, breathing structure that could hold back the cold, that could transform vulnerability into security. At midnight, the wind howled louder, rattling the stone shell and bending the pines, but Harris felt only the steady warmth against his skin. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax completely, closing his eyes and listening to the storm outside. It was beautiful in its fury, a reminder of the world's power and his own place within it. And then faintly came the sound of footsteps in the snow. Someone was approaching. Harris opened his eyes, squinting through the small window. A figure was trudging through the drift, struggling against the wind. A neighbor, he realized, carrying a lantern that swung wildly in the gusts. It was Mrs. Caldwell. She stopped at the edge of the porch, shivering violently, her face pale from the cold. Harris opened the door a crack and gestured for her to come in. You didn't have to," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "I'm not asking," Harris replied simply, stepping aside so she could enter. She stumbled slightly, and he steadied her with a firm grip. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical force. Her eyes widened, and for a long moment she didn't speak. She simply looked around, taking in the stone walls, the crackling stove, the faint smell of wood smoke that mingled with the cold earth that had followed her in. I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. It's warm, really warm, and it stayed." Harris shrugged, a small, wry smile tugging at his lips. "It just stones and fire, nothing more, but it works." She shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the walls. I never thought, I thought you were, I don't know, crazy." "Maybe I am," Harris said, sitting down in a chair pulled close to the stove. "Or maybe I just wanted to see if it could be done." They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the storm outside, the world muted by snow and stone. There was no mockery now, no judgment, only the quiet acknowledgement of effort, of perseverance, of something made real against the odds. When Mrs. Caldwell finally rose to leave, she placed a hand on his shoulder, hesitated, then said softly, You You might be onto something, Harold. Just Don. Stop. Harris nodded. I won't. As she disappeared into the night, bracing herself against the wind, Harris looked around his house. The stone shell was far from complete, but tonight it had proven itself. 2 days of warmth had already begun to feel like a small eternity, a triumph over the merciless winter. And for the first time, he felt the weight of loneliness lift slightly, not entirely, but enough to know that persistence had a way of drawing people in, even those who had once laughed. Outside, the storm continued, relentless and untamed, but inside, the house held its own. Harris felt a surge of hope, a quiet certainty that the work he had begun would not be in vain. The world might mock him, the neighbors might scoff, but he had discovered something that no opinion could touch. The satisfaction of knowing that he had built warmth, literally and figuratively, from the ground up. And as he settled in for the night, the fire radiating through the stone and wood, Harris allowed himself a rare, deep breath. There was still work to do, still stones to place, still tests to endure. But for tonight, at least, the house was more than shelter. It was proof that patience, knowledge, and stubbornness could defy even the coldest odds. The wind howled outside, but Harris smiled quietly to himself. He was ready for whatever came next. The storm had passed, leaving Mill Creek draped in a silence that was almost reverent. Snow coated every roof, every tree branch, every fence post, and the sun glinted off the frozen surfaces, turning the landscape into a blindingly bright, pristine world. For most of the neighbors, it was a day for shovels and scraping ice, for grumbling about the cold and checking on their battered cars. But for Harold Harris, it was a day of inspection, a meticulous, almost sacred walk through the aftermath of his experiment. He stepped outside, boots crunching in the snow, and circled the stone shell. The walls, though still incomplete, had survived the storm without so much as a single shifted stone. Frost clung to the rough surfaces, glittering like diamonds in the morning light, and the house seemed to hum with quiet pride, a tangible presence in the still air. Harris ran his hands along the stones, feeling the faint residual warmth from the fire inside. It was subtle but undeniably there, a whisper of heat that promised resilience. By mid-morning, the neighbors had begun to gather, not in laughter, not in mockery, but in cautious curiosity. They stood along the edges of the lane, keeping a respectful distance, their eyes following Harris as he moved with precise, deliberate steps, measuring and assessing every section of the wall. Jenkins was the first to speak. Well, I'll be damned, it didn't fall. Harris glanced at him, a small, dry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Nope, didn't fall. You didn't just get lucky, Jenkins continued, his voice tinged with awe. That storm, that was a monster, and your walls, they held. They held, Harris agreed, shrugging as if it were the simplest fact in the world. Now the test is whether they hold heat as long as I want them to. That's the real challenge. Some of the other neighbors shuffled forward, reluctant but intrigued. Mrs. Caldwell, still wrapped in her thick coat, peered at the house with a mixture of awe and disbelief. I didn't think it could survive a storm like that, she admitted. And you said the heat stayed. Harris nodded. Stayed for 2 days straight. Just had to keep the stove going for a little while, and the stones did the rest. A murmur ran through the group. People exchanged glances, a mix of surprise and grudging respect passing among them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Harris noticed it. He always noticed the details. That evening he carried out the next phase of his test, leaving the stove unlit for an extended period while the stone walls held onto the residual heat from the previous burn. Inside, the air remained surprisingly warm. It was a soft, steady heat, not the roaring intensity of a fire, but a lingering warmth that touched every corner of the room. Harris moved from one end to the other, measuring, noting, calculating, and feeling an overwhelming satisfaction. The structure wasn't just standing, it was performing. But as impressive as it was, the real challenge came from within. Harris had begun to feel the weight of solitude creeping into him, a quiet loneliness that even the success of the stone shell couldn't erase. Building the walls had been a solitary ritual, meditative in its repetition, but also isolating. No matter the awe of the neighbors, no matter the quiet respect that began to replace laughter, he realized that what he had built was more than just a wall. It was a fortress against not just winter, but the creeping feeling of being invisible, of being unheard. One night, as he settled in by the stove, he heard a faint scratching at the door. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the sound persisted, deliberate and measured. Harris rose cautiously and opened the door, revealing a small figure standing in the snow, Tommy, a boy of about 10 who lived a few houses down the lane. His cheeks were red from cold, and his eyes shone with both curiosity and trepidation. "Hi, Mr. Harris," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to see the house, the stone house." Harris studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." The boy entered, shaking off snow and breathless from the cold. His eyes widened as they took in the stone walls, the flickering firelight, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from every surface. "It's warm," he whispered, awe tinged with disbelief. "It is," Harris said, nodding. 2 days at least, that's what we're testing for now." Tommy's gaze lingered on the walls, tracing the uneven stones with his eyes. Did people laugh at you?" he asked softly. Harris smiled faintly. "A lot, some still do, but that's not the point. The point is whether it works, and it does." For a while they sat in companionable silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire, the faint whistle of wind around the edges of the incomplete stone shell. In that moment, Harris realized something profound. This house, this shell of stone over wood, wasn't just about survival. It was about connection, about demonstrating that patience, skill, and quiet determination could change perception, that it could inspire even the youngest observer to believe in what seems impossible. The days passed, and word of Harris's success spread slowly through Mill Creek. At first it was murmurs, a neighbor mentioning it at the grocery store, a whisper over the fence, the occasional hesitant glance from someone driving by. But gradually the interest became something more tangible. People began to approach the stone shell, not with mockery but with genuine curiosity, wanting to see how it had survived the storm, wanting to understand the secret behind the warmth. Harris welcomed it cautiously. He explained the basics without revealing every nuance, allowing the work itself to speak louder than words. And the more people saw, the more they began to respect it. A quiet shift occurred in the neighborhood. The laughter was replaced by curiosity, skepticism by admiration. Even Jenkins, who had been the loudest critic, came by one afternoon, standing at the edge of the lane, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I gotta admit," he said slowly, "I didn't think you'd pull it off, but you did. And it's impressive, real impressive." Harris nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement without allowing himself to be swayed by it. "Thanks," he said simply, "but there's still work to do. The shell's not finished." Jenkins gave a reluctant smile. "Yeah, well, you keep at it, old man. Maybe next winter we'll all be taking notes." That night, as Harris lay in bed, he reflected on the subtle changes he had observed over the past weeks. The stone shell had proven itself in the storm. It had retained heat for 2 full days. It had shifted perception among the neighbors. And yet the most important revelation was internal. Harris had discovered that perseverance could forge connections in the most unexpected ways, that a single act of stubborn determination could ripple outward and touch others. The house was no longer just a fortress against winter. It was a monument to patience, skill, and quiet triumph. And as he drifted off to sleep, listening to the gentle settling of snow on the roof, Harris felt a rare sense of peace. The struggle had been worth it. The work was not done, but he had already won in a way that mattered more than anyone's approval. He had created warmth, safety, and slowly understanding. Outside, the moon glinted off the stone walls, casting long shadows that danced across the snow. The wind had softened, and the world seemed still, waiting, as if recognizing that something remarkable had taken root in Mill Creek. A stubborn old man, his stone shell, and the quiet defiance of genius against doubt. Spring had not yet arrived in Mill Creek, but the days had begun to stretch longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting warmth that teased at the stubborn frost. The snowbanks were receding, revealing patches of brown grass and the muddy traces of winter's wrath. And amidst this slow awakening, Harris's stone shell stood like a sentinel, a monument of patience, skill, and quiet rebellion against the relentless winters that had once dominated his life. By now, the neighbors no longer mocked him. Laughter had been replaced with curiosity, skepticism with admiration, and even the children treated his property with a kind of reverent awe. They would pass by in the mornings, pressing their noses against the frosted windows, imagining the warmth that persisted within. Some would wave, others simply nodded, and Harris, in his quiet way, nodded back. He never sought recognition, only the satisfaction of seeing his work endure. Yet there were new challenges. Completing the stone shell meant scaling higher, reinforcing walls that were beginning to form a rough roofline over the wood structure. Each day brought a new test of balance, of judgment, of endurance. Harris's hands were raw from labor, the knuckles stiff with cold, and yet he persisted, methodically placing each stone with the same care he had from the very first. One afternoon, as he worked near the highest point of the structure, he heard a familiar voice call out, "Need a hand?" Harris looked down to see Jenkins, a pair of work gloves in his hands, his breath visible in the crisp air. There was a tentative sincerity in the offer, a quiet acknowledgement of Harris's achievement. "I might," Harris admitted after a pause, "but only if you follow instructions." Jenkins grinned a little sheepishly and climbed up the slope beside the stone wall. "I can do that. Just don't let me ruin all your hard work." Together they lifted stones, arranged them with careful precision, and worked in a rhythm that neither needed to explain. Harris gave instructions sparingly, correcting angles, suggesting placement, and slowly, with steady effort, the walls began to take on their final form. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the property, Harris stepped back to survey the progress. The shell was nearly complete. Its irregular stones gave it an organic beauty, rough yet elegant, and he could already feel the way the residual heat would circulate, holding warmth far longer than any ordinary structure could. But it wasn't just the heat that mattered anymore. It was the story that the house told, of persistence, of ingenuity, of refusing to be defined by the narrow expectations of others. For decades, Harris had been a solitary figure, quiet, steadfast, often misunderstood. But now, with the stone shell standing firm, there was evidence that even a single determined individual could shift perception, could turn ridicule into respect, could create something tangible that outlasted opinion. That evening, he lit the stove for a final trial. The flames danced brightly, radiating warmth into every corner of the stone and wood sanctuary. He moved through the room, feeling the air thicken with heat testing corners, measuring the subtle gradients. Every hour that passed confirmed what he already knew. The shell worked. The fire's energy was trapped, circulated, and released steadily, lasting far longer than any ordinary winter night could demand. Word of the success had spread. By dusk, several neighbors, including Mrs. Caldwell and Tommy, had gathered outside, peering in through the windows. They marveled at the flickering light and the soft glow that emanated from the walls. Jenkins stood silently, respect evident in his posture. For the first time, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only acknowledgement of something extraordinary that had been built with hands, patience, and relentless determination. Tommy pressed his small hands to the glass. "It's like magic," he whispered. Harris smiled faintly. "It's not magic," he said, his voice steady, warm. "It's understanding how things work and knowing what you can endure to make them work." As night fell, Harris stepped outside, leaning against the rough stone. The neighbors lingered nearby, some keeping their distance, others inching closer, drawn by curiosity and admiration. The sky was clear, stars twinkling in a deep velvet expanse, and the wind was gentle, carrying only the faintest chill. He could hear the creek thawing slowly, the water running beneath ice that had survived winter's grip. And in that quiet, Harris realized that the stone shell was more than walls and stones. It was a testament, a reminder that resilience, thoughtfulness, and a refusal to bow to doubt could create something enduring, not just a house, but a legacy. The months that followed solidified his achievement. The house became the talk of Mill Creek, not in ridicule, but in admiration. People came to see it, children explored it, and neighbors began to rethink their own assumptions about persistence, effort, and ingenuity. Some even offered to help, bringing stones, wood, and encouragement. The house had become a symbol, a shared story of triumph over hardship and skepticism. Winter returned eventually, as it always did, harsher than ever. But Harris was ready. The stove burned steadily, The stone walls held warmth far longer than any ordinary structure could, and for the first time he experienced a deep, enduring comfort, not just physical but emotional. The laughter that had once followed him across the lane was gone. In its place was respect, understanding, and even a kind of awe. One evening, as the fire's glow illuminated the uneven stones, Harris thought about the journey, the solitude, the ridicule, the painstaking labor. He thought about the neighbors who had doubted him, the nights spent shivering, the challenges of lifting and placing each stone, and he felt an immense sense of quiet triumph. Not arrogance, not showmanship, but the profound satisfaction of having proven something vital, that perseverance, skill, and vision could withstand the harshest elements and the harshest judgment alike. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, the creek murmured beneath ice, and the world seemed still in acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. Harris stood by the window, hands resting on the sill, and allowed himself a rare, deep smile. The stone shell was complete. It was more than a shelter. It was a story, a monument, a lesson that echoed through every flake of snow and every flicker of firelight. For once, Harold Harris didn't need approval. The house had spoken for him. And the warmth that lingered long after the fire had burned low was a reminder that stubbornness, patience, and unwavering belief in one's work could do more than survive. It could inspire, endure, and triumph. The stone shell over wood walls stood firm, glowing softly under the night sky, a testament to resilience. And in that light, Harris knew that he had not just built a house. He had built something timeless, proof that determination, ingenuity, and courage could weather any storm, endure any skepticism, and leave behind warmth that would outlast even the coldest winter. The ridge was quiet now, the neighbors dispersed, but their curiosity lingering like an unspoken respect. And Harold Harris finally felt a deep and unshakable peace. He had been mocked, he had been doubted, he had endured. And now, as the fire's glow bathed the walls and the wind whispered approval through the trees, he had triumphed. The world could do its worst. The storms could come and go. But his house, his work, and his warmth would endure, for 2 days, for weeks, for years, and for anyone willing to witness the quiet power of patience and perseverance. The ridge was his, the warmth was his, and the victory, hard-earned and undeniable, belonged entirely to him.